Thank you, Robbie, for that extraordinary presentation. You all know now why you have to read this book. I want to start with the word white, because what's very important about that chart you showed is that when you add white Christians with African American and Latino Christians, you still have a majority. A few things about that, and you could take this in a number of directions as you wish. This may change the public face of Christianity itself, and I think we're seeing that around the immigration issue. There is a habit, which both of us have talked about and bemoan, the sentence, evangelical Christians are Republicans. Well, that leaves out a whole lot of evangelical Christians who happen to be African American and also, in many cases, Latino. It was striking last week that Hillary Clinton's comment on the killings of both young black men by police and the killing of police officers in Dallas came in a speech to the anniversary of the AME Church in Philadelphia, which reminds you of the profound importance of the African American Christian tradition. Could you talk about how we should think about these things, the issues raised by the word white in your title?
Well, the first thing to me is like this: when I say white, I mean white non-Hispanic, right? Americans, right? So that we have screened out Latinos from that designation. But it is important to say that I really am talking about a decline, among this kind of white and primarily white Protestant world. But that leaves a whole range of Christianity, pretty vibrant. So African Americans, kind of recall that chart, have not lost members in the way that white Protestants have. However, I think they are struggling a bit with the younger generation and keeping them engaged. And there's been some tensions, actually, between the Black Lives Matter movement and the kind of older civil rights movement that's more rooted in the churches that I think is kind of playing out a bit. And Latino churches are growing and so both Protestant churches, Latino Protestant churches are growing. Many of them are non-denominational, charismatic in their kind of worship style. And also Latino Catholics is worth saying. So the chart I didn't put up there is that if you look at Catholics in the country and you kind of go back again to the 70s and forward, what you basically see is that the number of Catholics in the country haven't changed that much at all. But the only reason that's true is because of Hispanic replacement of white attrition. Right, and so that it's maintained to be about 1 in 5 Americans are Catholic, but Catholics as a whole, as you know, have lost an enormous amount of members, and it's been mostly white, non-Hispanic Catholics that they've lost.
Yeah, I recall from a Pew study that former white Catholics are either the second or third largest religious denomination in the country.
Right, they make about 1 in 10 Americans are former Catholics today.
Amazing. This is a wonderful book, wonderfully written, by the way.
Thank you.
Right, it's not just wonderfully argued, but it's written with an artist's eye for detail and anecdote. And there were a lot of things in this very rich book that you didn't have a chance to talk about in your presentation. I'm going to invite you to talk about now one strand that really struck me forcefully. One way of summarizing your religious narrative in the past 40 or 50 years is it's the triumph of ideology over theology. And let me tell you why I say that. Here are 3 examples. You describe the Southern Baptists' U-turn on abortion. I think that was in 1979. That was a big deal, right? And it set the stage for a lot of the conservative religious politics of the past two generations. You might well say, second, that the tension between Protestants and Catholics in America was one of the defining features of the American religious scene. But within the past generation, we've actually seen a treaty of peace between Protestants and Catholics, which was really historic and was once again driven, I think, in your narrative, by politics. And then, of course, most recently, white Protestants who had previously denounced Mormonism as a cult. You recall the Republican Party's founding convention in 1856. On the cover of the program, the twin relics of barbarism. One was slavery, The other was Mormonism. Suddenly, Mormons are in the fold. Once again, these theological differences appear to fade away in the face of political exigency. What happened? Why did these theological divisions disappear in our lifetime?
Well, I do think one of the things that I was struck with as I kind of put the data together, is this partisan polarization, right, that is sort of run through the parties, and so partisanship and race, I think, were the two kind of powerful pieces that have kind of divided religious groups, and the story of kind of who's in and who's out, in white Christian America, I think is really important one. I mean, I have some episodes early on where we kind of dial back to the early part of the 20th century. And like intermarriage between Protestants and Catholics was a really big deal. It wasn't just, these weren't kind of cousins being married. I mean, this was like different religions being married. It was a very, very strong taboo. And in fact, I have an anecdote in the book of a Protestant minister actually showed up and shot and killed a Catholic priest who had married his daughter without his knowledge. These kinds of tensions were very, very real.
Neither Joe Kennedy nor Rose Kennedy showed up, when Kathleen Kennedy married a Protestant, a British Protestant. They didn't come to the wedding.
Interesting, yeah. So it lingers. But what's interesting, I think, is that as the numbers have declined, so as sort of white Protestant dominance has been less and less possible because of demographic changes, the doors have come open to admitting other people who previously would never have been admitted, right? So this kind of alliance between white evangelicals and Catholics, and there was a great, there's a marker for this, is this document called Evangelicals and Catholics Together in the early 90s, right? That really was about making the theological case for cooperation across these lines on a whole range of political issues that happen to comport with the Republican agenda for the most part. But I think what's interesting to me is that the Methodists were more than willing to go it alone when they thought they were the most powerful denomination in the country. But as sort of they realized, actually our numbers are declining, we need some other coalition partners, then the doors sort of come open. Same thing with evangelicals, I think, with Mormons, finding common political cause as they realize, as the Christian right movement is waning and not able to kind of deliver, I think, on its own. So I think it's this kind of political necessity that has driven a lot of these barriers down. And that's a pretty interesting phenomenon, particularly if you think about it in a theological key.
I want to underscore that and then move to your piece today in the New York Times. If you haven't read it, Robbie has a really good piece in the Times today on Trump. The new ecumenism is, as Bill suggests, entirely ideological, that you have conservative Catholics, Protestants, some Orthodox Jews, and others on the one side of the divide, liberal Catholics, Protestants, more liberal Jews, and others on the other side. And Alan Wolfe has made this point forcefully, that no one argues about the virgin birth anymore, the meaning of the Nicene Creed, predestination, except maybe that you're destined to hell if you vote for the wrong party. And, this is really striking. So it's a peculiar kind of divisive ecumenism, if you will, divided by ideology, and that this actually is symptomatic in Wolfe's view, not of the importance of religion in our politics, but of the declining importance of religion in our politics, because these aren't theological questions, these are political questions. But I'd also like you to talk about the split in particular that we're seeing among evangelical Christians. And in the recent survey that we did an event on a couple of weeks ago here, there was a very striking question where we asked if things are so bad in the country that we need a president who breaks some of the rules to put the country right, which some could see as a symptom of not a symptom, but an indication of a more authoritarian view, at least less of a constitutional view. And when you looked at that question among evangelicals, it was really quite decisive as to whether people supported Trump or not. The folks who said things are so bad that we need a really strong leader, were for Trump, and the people who disagreed with that were not for Trump. So talk about those two things, sort of the rise of ideology, just elaborate a little more, and then what are we to make of what evangelicals may end up, white evangelicals may end up doing this year?
Well, it's important to say it's also, I mean, Robert Withnow identified this rift, right? That the fights were no longer going to be between Protestants and Catholics, but between liberal Catholics and conservative Catholics and liberal Protestants and conservative Protestants a while back. But we're seeing that really come to fruition. And the other piece you were asking about was the Trump, and that one of the interesting things we've seen in both on the ground, right? So you have on the one hand some of the old guard, James Dobson, Jerry Falwell Jr., all sort of lining up behind Trump on the one hand, and then you've got some newer voices on the scene like Russell Moore at the Southern Baptist Convention, very much lining up against Trump, and in fact saying like very strong things like, well, if this is what it means to be evangelical, I'm going to stop using the term. That's something pretty strong for someone who's actually on staff at the Southern Baptist Convention to say. But we did see it in the data as well, and we saw a couple of different breaks that I think are important. That we see on the one hand, right, the people who have this view that things are so bad that we just need someone who, even if they have to break the rules, whatever they got to do to fix things. There was a sizable group of evangelicals that said that and then supported Trump. On the other hand, the group that said they did not believe that question were less likely to support Trump. And then the other dividing line we found is that, in some previous survey data as well, is that those evangelicals who attended religious services weekly or more, and particularly the more than once a week crowd, were also less likely, so we're more tightly tied to an institutional church, we're also less likely to support Trump than not. So we had that kind of a divide. And you can see that showing up among Mormons also, who are more likely to attend frequently and be tied to religious institutions, less likely to support Trump. But maybe the most, what I argued in the piece in the Times today was that there's kind of a utilitarian tendency that's crept into evangelical thinking here that basically says, look, things are so bad that we have an end here that we need to meet, that the means matter less, right? So the end we need to achieve is so important, and things are such in crisis that even if we have to do some things with dirty hands now, like get behind Trump, even though he doesn't sort of fit our kind of values voters frame, so be it. And in fact, the starkest quote that I quote is the pastor of First Baptist Church, pretty influential church, Robert Jeffries. In Dallas, yeah. Who came out and said, look, I'm going to just break it down for you. Here's what's going on. Like, when I see the crisis we're facing and the threats facing evangelical Christians today, I want the meanest son of a you-know-what in the Oval Office, and that's where I think many evangelicals are. And that was like putting it out there in a very, very bald way.
Let me shift to another one of the contemporary manifestations of these religious changes and what some people on the losing end see as a moral and political as well as religious crisis. And that is the rise of what you characterize, and I think would be fair to say, criticize as a very expansive conception of religious liberty, which you see as a rearguard effort to resist some of the changes, including Supreme Court decisions. In that connection, I'd like to just spend a minute reading a very instructive quote from your book. And it goes as follows. No one shares life with God whose religion does not flow out naturally and without effort into all relations of his life. Whoever uncouples the religious and social life has not understood Jesus. Whoever sets any bounds for the reconstructive power of the religious life over the social relations and human institutions to that extent denies the faith of the Master. That, for the theologically informed among you, is Walter Rauschenbusch, the pioneer of the social gospel. Now, Rauschenbusch refused to cabin faith narrowly, simply to private observance. He insisted that it flow out, as he said, into all of the social and political, all of the human institutions of life. So here's my question. What's the difference between Rauschenbusch's position and the expansive conception of religious liberty that the theological conservatives are now pressing?
Next question? No. No, that's a great question. I think it is really instructive, and I think that passage would probably ring true for any sincerely faithful person, right, who had religion as a very serious part of their being, like that it has to flow out into all areas of your life. You can't compartmentalize, one's faith. I think the difference is, for here, what ends up happening, I think, with the religious liberty piece of things is that it's a very, Rauschenbusch, when he was talking about that, he was talking about like the labor movement, and it wasn't, I think, bringing forward like a very sort of narrow view, I think, in a self-serving way, and I think that may be the difference here is that. For me, like when I looked at the evangelical move on same-sex marriage, or on these religious liberty angles, it seemed very clearly they don't pop up really severely until you start seeing public opinion really moving into majority territory, and it becomes very clear at the national level, at least, that that's no longer going to be the public view of things, and particularly after the Obergefell decision last summer. What we end up seeing is, I think there's now like 100 of these religious liberty bills that have popped up across the country, and they're just very clearly a response to sort of losing the battle at the national level and trying to figure out either can I carve out a space in my state for trying to sort of not follow sort of what the Supreme Court has said. Is there a way to kind of carve out these exemptions from the state or not? And I actually think also this is a place where Trump and Cruz, you can see a real difference here. Like Cruz was pretty much all about the religious liberty exemptions, right? This was like a very campaign point he was campaigning on. And I think one of the reasons why that Trump actually had more of an appeal to evangelicals than Cruz was that while Cruz was saying, hey, I'm going to assure you exemptions from these battles that we've lost, Trump was saying, no, I'm actually going to like turn the tide of the war. I'm not going to kind of give you an exemption to a battle we're going to concede we've lost. We're going to restore power to the Christian churches, and we're going to turn back the clock. And I think
we're going to be able to say Merry Christmas.
That's
again,
right. Yeah,
he said over and over.
We're going to we're going to kind of win this culture war battle. I mean, to me, that has a very different feel than the kinds of things that Rauschenbusch was sort of championing. And I mean, I think they have in common the sense that it flows from faith. Right, I think that's in common, but it seems very different for me to sort of, one group pushing sort of a battle that they've like lost in the court of public opinion and in the legal courts, and I don't know the kind of stuff that Rauschenbusch was championing.
If one thing that jumps out of your title is race, the other thing that jumps out of your analysis on page after page is age, and we saw that very strikingly. One of the reasons the turnout patterns in midterms is different is not only race, but also age. I wanted you to talk about that also in relationship to the Tea Party and who the Tea Party is. And, research and earlier research that we did showed that to people's surprise, or some people's surprise, Tea Partiers were not a new libertarian movement in the country. There are some Tea Party libertarians. They overlapped in a substantial way with the religious conservative movement. Tea Party members had quite conservative views on a whole lot of social issues and obviously very conservative views or restrictionist views on immigration. And in the end, when you boiled it down, it's because an awful lot of white evangelical Christians and an awful lot of Tea Partiers were over the age of 50, and in many cases, over the age of 65. So could you talk about that? And having grown up in Mississippi yourself, maybe you could also relate that to real big regional differences in the country on these questions.
I thought it was Georgia.
Well, I was born in Georgia, but grew up in Mississippi. Yeah,
okay,
all along I-20. So the Tea Party is really, if we think about that last chart I showed, the two groups that are on the right-hand side, about 7 and 10, saying that they think things have changed for the worse since the 1950s, are white evangelical Protestants and the Tea Party. Well, and when we did some analysis back in 2010, actually, we were one of the first organizations in partnership with Brookings to really dial down to see who the Tea Party were. And what we found is that they actually, about half of them, counted themselves also as members of the old Christian right movement, right? So basically, the Tea Party had borrowed heavily from foot soldiers of the Christian right movement, and that's why on issues like abortion or same-sex marriage, Tea Party members didn't look like libertarians; they looked like social conservatives on these issues. Strongly opposed to abortion, legalization of abortion, strongly opposed to same-sex marriage, and I think they shared this kind of worldview of kind of thinking, yeah, things were better back in the 1950s. And part of that is that both of these groups are aging. Right, so they've had so the Tea Partiers, typically a little over 50, and white evangelical Protestants have had, again, just in the past 10 years, especially, have their average age has been creeping up as they've been having a harder time holding on to younger people, and that has been a real sea change. So one of the things we might have expected, for example, on same-sex marriage, is that white evangelicals have moved a little bit on that issue, but they have not moved a lot as the rest of the country has been moving. And one of the reasons why they haven't been moving as much as other groups is because the way they would have moved, as if those young people had stayed inside those ranks, right? And then they would have been counted and moved that whole group. But as young people have been leaving the white evangelical world, they've remained kind of anchored in an older generational view on this issue. And so I think that dynamic is driving, I think, a lot of, also, I think, in addition to the demographic changes, this sense among, I think, white Protestant groups in particular, that they're losing a whole generation of people and having a hard time holding on to them is, I think, accentuating the anxieties that they're feeling about the bigger demographic changes in the whole country.
Bill, could I cheat and just ask a follow-up, and then you can take two before we go to the audience?
No. I'll leave you isolated as the sole cheater.
Okay, I can live with that. One of the things, I talk about this in my book, which I also draws, I should say, on Robbie's data. One of the hard things to figure out over the last 40, 50 years in analyzing the rise of the religious conservative movement, the religious right, is how intertwined that was with the conversion of the white South into toward the Republican Party, and that was a kind of slow process that accelerated with the first with Strom Thurmond's third party campaign, and really accelerated with Goldwater's campaign. How do you disentangle? In the case of white Protestant America, particularly in the South, though not exclusively in the South, how do you disentangle attitudes toward race, opposition to civil rights, from sort of purely religious questions? Because it's a tricky question. Because I think it's extremely important to recognize this. As soon as you say this, somebody says you're saying all these people are racist. No, that's not what you're saying. Or at least that's not what I am saying. And yet, it is very clear that the racial reaction preceded the rise of the religious conservative movement. How do you sort that out?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated story. So, I grew up in Mississippi, so have some kind of firsthand, feel for this. But, what's really clear, you can see it in the data, you can see it in the historical record, and, reading your book, Why the Right Went Wrong, was also a good way, who really is really helpful in kind of understanding Goldwater, I think your book was, and its continued influence in our politics today. And I think, the analysis I did shows largely the same thing, that what you see is what, I love this term, that these two political scientists who happen to be twin brothers, Merle and Earl Black, wrote this great book called The Rise of the Republican South that really did track this, and they called it the Great White Switch, right, that happened when sort of post-civil rights, and there were sort of a lot of disgruntled whites in the South that began still identifying as Democrat, but started voting Republican at the top of the ticket. And by the time you get to Reagan, they had done this enough. They had voted for Republicans at the top of the ticket, Democrats at local level, that they finally figured out, well, maybe I'm a Republican. And what you see is that during the 80s and with Reagan, it was Reagan's presidency that was also wrapped up with the launching of the Christian right. So it's all right there together, right? That this kind of early founding of the Christian conservative political movement was about getting Reagan elected and being deeply disappointed with Carter's presidency, who was one of their own, right? And I think that sort of backlash against Carter, the sort of move and sort of backlash against civil rights is absolutely part of the story here. You really can't excise the racial component, I think, from the launch of the Christian right, and particularly the switch of whites in the South from being the kind of solid Democratic South to the solid Republican South that we have today.
God bless Merle and Earl. It's good that you raised them. They were very good.
Couldn't be better named.
Yeah.
You can just see the dueling banjos there. Let me just drop a footnote to that before I move on to the next question. I have long believed, and I think your book suggests that you may believe this too, that the trigger during the Carter administration for the Great White Switch was the attack on the tax exemption of the
Bob Jones
the
University.
White Academy. Yes.
Which, by the way, began under Richard Nixon, but everybody forgot that when Jimmy Carter carried the policy to its fruition. But I agree with you on that.
Yeah. First of all, I just want to, I just want to tweak E.J. a little. If you look at the famous opinions about changes in American culture since the 1950s, there is no difference between white mainline Protestants and white Catholics on that question. In each, in the case of white mainline Protestants, you have 58% saying that the change has been for the worse. For Catholics, you have 58% saying the change is for the worse, white Catholics. So this is not just a white Protestant phenomenon. It is, it is a much broader sentiment, which actually brings me now to my question. Towards the end of the book, you warn, I think, sagely against what you call the siren song of nostalgia. Nice phrase. But as your own research points out, fully 53% of Americans as we speak are listening to this siren song. So I want to invite you to speculate a little bit. What does this say about our present moment, that 53% of Americans are looking back on 6 decades of American history and saying, we took the wrong path, we don't like these changes? What does that mean, not just for our politics, but for our culture and our sense of ourselves as a people?
Yeah. Pass the next question again. No. I think it's troubling. As I think is what it is. I mean, at the end of the book, I'm trying to kind of sort out where do we go from here,
Right.
And I think that's
that is the question.
Yeah, and on the one hand, like I do think there's some real dangers in nostalgia. Nostalgia is never, it's never really accurate, right? You sort of always sort of think back with a kind of rose-colored glasses, and you sort of selectively remember what was good, and you sort of forget what was bad, and so in that sense, I think it has a real danger to it, and that's why I call it the siren song of nostalgia. If I could speak theologically for just a minute, I mean, I think the danger for white Christians in the country, again, sort of theological term, what the temptation is to try to resurrect a 1950s Protestant dominance when it's not really that possible, I think, to do that at our current moment. The line I have in the book is I say that resurrection by human power rather than divine power always produces a monstrosity, something akin to Frankenstein, right? And that temptation, I think, can be a real danger, because I think that what instead of something that's sort of organic, what you have is something that's sort of propped up by power, and kind of, I think flagrant uses of power that I think becomes sort of dangerous both for those within and without that world. So I think that's the real challenge. And the problem, I think, is that we are still struggling, I think, as a country to tell a story that has a place for everyone, right? And I think that is, and part of what the anxiety among white Protestants and white Christians who feel themselves sort of, they know they've lost their place at the center, and they know they've been sort of pushed to the side, and they're profoundly anxious about that. And I think one of the challenges is trying to figure out what is the story of America that still has a place for the descendants of white Christian America, right? Is there a story that they can still feel a part of? Because I think one of the problems is they look at the older white Protestants, for example, look at America, and the America they see doesn't reflect the vision that they grew up with. and that's a real place of dissonance for them. So I think, how does that, I don't think I have any easy answers here, but I think one of the things that has to happen is we have to come up with a new story that is telling the story of America that includes those people, but also means that it's going to be very different from the vision that they had to begin with.
Well, if I want it to be grandiose, and this will be my closing note before we turn it over to you for the last half hour, if I wanted to be grandiose, I would say that the twin pillars of America for 250 years were, on the one hand, the Constitution, and on the other hand, what many have called the informal Protestant establishment. And what you're charting is the removal of one of those pillars. This is, and I will not literally quote Vice President Biden, a big deal. I might also say, in conclusion, that my deepest fear is that nostalgia isn't what it used to be.
Could I just go on your last wonderful answer and Bill's comment were brought to you by Paul Simon's song Kodachrome, if some of you may remember that song. But one thing before we go to the audience, because I really want you to have a chance to talk about this, one of the reasons I like the book so much and like the way you think is because you are describing a reality which you are essentially saying white Christian America has to come to terms with, but you do not do this in a harsh way, and you actually talk about the contributions that white Christian America made to all of us, including those who are not white Protestants or white Christians. I'd just like you to close on that before we go to the audience, because I think it's very important that you wrote the book that way. It wasn't triumphalist. It was just, this is who we are, and we got to deal with it. Could you talk? I'd like you to go. You've done a lot on the obituary. I'd like you to close this section with your eulogy.
Yeah. Well, I did intentionally frame it as a eulogy, and I tried to think about this as like, if I were a pastor at a really complicated death, right? What would I say? Where you've got like warring factions of the family. And you've got people showing up at the funeral who people haven't seen in 20 years, right? And then some people are like, I'm so glad the guy's dead, whatever. There's like a whole, and there's people crying on the front row and celebrating on the back row, and what do you say when you have a funeral like that? And so I really try to kind of dust off my MDiv and put on my pastoral hat and try to think about it that way as a metaphor. And to folks who may be grieving, and I think it's a lot of the country, right, that fits this descendants of white Christian America model. It's 47% of the country, right? That's a lot of people. So what do
Funny that it's 47%. I just want to note that, but anyway. Get into a lot of trouble with that.
Just by the way, the share of the vote that Mitt Romney got, there is a God.
So what do we say? What do we say to those? And I think what I was trying to kind of come up with is, you couldn't, if you went outside, in D.C. and you walked 6 blocks, you probably would pass some institution that has its history in what I'm calling white Christian America, right? That has its roots there, that was founded by people who were, again, back to this quote, if you were, charged something big and important in 1950, you were probably a mainline Protestant, that was kind of the world. So everything from like hospitals to social clubs to, there were all kind of universities and colleges that, maybe now no one really understands. But if you go back and you look at the founding documents, those really white Christian America was like responsible for many of those institutions that have held the civic to use, this is a term I stole from E.J., that served as America's civic glue for most of the country's life. And I think it's important to acknowledge that contribution, right? So even for the people who might want to celebrate its death, that should be acknowledged, I think. And it should also be acknowledged that it's really unclear what, if this is sort of passing from the scene, what is going to serve that role? What's going to play that role? Right, a kind of, if you think about Lincoln's second inaugural address, you think about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. These documents depended on a kind of vocabulary and a set of tradition that to make them really mean what they meant, you have to really understand the sort of theological allusions that they had. So if we're going to lose the ability for that kind of vocabulary, what's going to replace it? And I don't really think I've got any easy answers for that. But I think it's important for that to be acknowledged, particularly for the folks that are like, I think maybe sometimes too ready to celebrate sort of the passing of this world from the scene. So I try to do a little bit of both, of kind of addressing kind of these different worlds, and I think it's some of the ways we see these divisions, I think, showing at the seams in our public life now, right? In our partisan politics and the kind of racial tensions that we see in front of us, and I think we're kind of at a crossroads, and I think it's going to require some really serious reflection and hopefully, I think, some wisdom to figure out how to mend some of these fences and figure out how to build something new in the remains of, as the remains of white Christian America lay dormant. So.
Well, I personally wouldn't object to a modest revival, of judge not lest ye be judged. We could do a lot better. We could do a lot worse. And, I just want to pivot to the audience by noting that 6 decades ago, the young Catholic J.D. Mario Cuomo couldn't get a job in a Manhattan law firm. And now white Protestants can't get a job in the Supreme Court. Go figure. Yes, sir. Yes, and wait until the roving microphone reaches you, and then introduce yourself any way you'd like.
Hi, I'm Gene Robinson, a bishop in the Episcopal Church. I think this falls in the category of ideology triumphing over theology. So religious liberty often gets fought out on kind of a ridiculous level, like baking wedding cakes, right? Those same bakers who want an exemption so they don't have to bake wedding cakes for gay couples are not screening out those getting remarried, which Jesus clearly labels a sin, remarriage after divorce. So why did this issue rise to the surface as the location for the fight over religious liberty? And secondly, how does the spate of bathroom bills fit into that?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. It is interesting to see that what's really clear is that from the very beginning of the rise of the conservative Christian movement in particular, opposition to gay rights was right there at the very beginning, in a way that opposition to abortion was not, right? And so it's interesting to sort of note that it's actually more firmly ensconced in its launching there. And, I'm not sure I got the full answer to kind of why it is. It certainly was, in its day in the 70s, right? I mean, a large number of Americans who were not conservative Christians shared those, so in some ways it was sort of borrowing, and so even in the 80s, right, when the Christian right was making the claim that it was the moral majority, there was a kernel of truth to that, right? That they could sort of look at public opinion and their stance comported into somewhat with public opinion. So I'm not sure I got a great answer for exactly why that issue from the beginning. You probably have a better answer than I do to that question. But what's interesting to me is that it has held on as a defining issue of that group, and I think that because of that, the clear and also the very clear loss on this issue, I think, has set off what I think many people still have not quite grasped, the enormity of the Obergefell decision last year for conservative white Christians in the country. I mean, it was a nuclear event, that sort of upset 4 decades worth of political activism. I mean, it was a big, big deal. And I think that's why we've seen the sort of eruption of these bills. And, it's basically, I think, various tactics. So some of it's about singling out transgender people, right? So if you lose on gay and lesbian couples, sort of the next tactic is to sort of single out transgender people as a way to win. But what's interesting is in the Mississippi law that was just recently overturned, they did take aim at a much broader swath, and in fact, that Mississippi law could have been interpreted as holding up single parents, cohabitating couples. It did take aim at a much broader, but it was overturned in its entirety, I think, just last week or the week before. So I think there has been an attempt to sort of take on a little bit broader, but for the most part, it has been sort of focused on sort of same-sex marriage, and then with that loss, moving on to kind of limiting or providing exemptions on a whole range of fronts.
By the way, Oh, my God. Let me apologize in advance. There are enough people in this room to trigger a visit from the fire marshal. There is no way that I'm going to be able to get to all of your questions, but I suspect strongly that Robbie will be willing to stay around for a little while.
Why don't we get a couple at a time to have two questions thrown at him just to include a few more folks.
Well, all
And then
right.
he can skip the hard one.
Okay. I'm going to recognize the gentleman over there, and then second in from the row.
Do we have one mic?
Oh, we've got two back there.
Why doesn't the second mic pre-position itself over here in the name of efficiency? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Hilaire Sobers. I'm a staff attorney with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Thank you very much for your presentation, Dr. Jones. Two quick questions. The first one is, in your research, did you disaggregate for membership in the Ku Klux Klan, as part of, white Christian America? And I'd be curious as to, what your findings were if you did. And then secondly, what do you make of efforts, I would say, principally by white Christian America, perhaps in the last maybe decade and a half, to introduce or to integrate creationism into the education curriculum? And we had a major case, I think, Dover case back in 2005, and I'm just wondering whether that is part of the sort of backlash, the sort of resistance to this loss of privilege or standing.
Thank you.
And
my name is Nelson. I'm a political scientist a scholar from George Washington University. I have
From where?
George Washington University.
Thank you.
Okay, so three brief questions.
No. We don't have time for three questions.
Two questions. Okay. So from I missed a cross tabulation, let's say, between religion and party affiliation. I guess the biggest group that is increasing is non-religious affiliated. Mm-hmm. How it's related to not to a specific coalition, but to political parties. I would guess they would be among the independent voters. The second question is that if those trends you showed, I guess they're not evenly distributed among the countries. If there is a kind of geographically concentrated, that you would say that it's changing, but it's not changing. It's concentrating. It's not. If you have the broad perspective, and can I make my third? No.
There's a principle of fairness at work here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have KKK, evolution, and the unaffiliated. All right, so I'll start back over here. So the unaffiliated, right, is absolutely the fastest growing, quote unquote, religious group in the country. When we look back in the 1990s, all the way through the 1990s, the religiously unaffiliated were in single digits. So less than 1 in 10 Americans claim to be religiously unaffiliated. The number today is 23%, all right, and it keeps going up. And it's predominantly driven by younger people. One note I'll make, kind of connected to Gene's comment, is we did ask young people who had been raised religious and left, why they left, right? And we got a range of kind of mundane answers, but one that sort of stood out is that a third of them said that they left over anti-gay teachings or negative treatment of gay and lesbian people, right? So that's it's not the majority, but it is a sizable group that said like a third of that group left because of that. So that's, I'll kind of put the pin in that there. So the KKK and evolution. So we do have no data that I know of in any of our data on KKK affiliation, but I will say that I do talk in the book about the history of race and civil rights and resistance to civil rights in the book and in the chapter on race. And one thing that's really clear is that there was kind of this Jerry Falwell Sr. Is kind of a really good person to kind of look at this. When civil rights, when people were marching on civil rights, Falwell preached a famous sermon about that basically Christianity was about saving souls and not about politics, right? That preachers had no business in the streets, that they should stay in the pulpits and not in the streets. Not a decade later, when the Christian right, when he was part of the kind of Christian right getting off the ground, completely flipped his tune in less than a decade, really, to talk about the importance of Christians standing up for their values in the public realm. So there was a kind of real shift, really, and it was sort of quiet on civil rights. But then when these other issues, right, anti-LGBT moves, and then when abortion came on the scene, it became more activist piece. I would see the evolution thing as being of a piece here, and I think many of these actions are about, preserving a world or preserving enclaves of a world that's been sort of lost at the national level. And I guess to kind of put the ribbon on it back over here, you do see in the book I actually have a chart or a map where I map out where white Protestants are still dominant, and basically what you see is it's the Deep South and Appalachia and parts of the Midwest, right? And that's where you see. There's only 6 states though where that are majority white and Protestant. So it's not that many, but and the rest of them are 40% Protestant or more. Yep.
Just in the back of your head as you answer some of these questions, because Bishop Robinson's question put this in my head. Can you try to distinguish, which is something I struggle with a lot, analyzing this stuff, between the theological and the moral on the one side and the tribal and cultural on the other? I think that's one of the tricky problems we have in understanding what you're writing about, but just keep that in the back of your head. Bill, go ahead.
Okay, a sea of hands. Okay, I'm now going to go to 3. First of all, the woman on the aisle there, then the gentleman on the aisle, a few up, and then this gentleman right here. And then I'm going to move to the other side of the room for the next tranche of questions.
My name is Joe Freeman. I write about women in politics. And I'd like to know which of all these groups you studied have gender gaps and how big and what the range of gender gaps was among those groups.
Great
Thank you.
question.
Bill D'Antonio, sociology. One of the observations that I was expecting is the difference between the mainline Protestants, especially in Congress, was that they were both Democrats and Republicans. There was no period of time when you didn't have Democrats and Republicans, even when there were, at one point, 64 of the 100 seats in the Senate were held by mainline Protestants. When you look at Congress and you look at the evangelicals, I can't find an evangelical who's a Democrat. And I think I don't know how much in the book you reflect on the fact that an evangelical is to be a Republican identified in very narrow ways. And what we've really lost is the mainline Protestants, not only in their church going, but in their presence in Congress.
Right. Why evangelicals, the Republican Party at prayer. Yes.
Thank you very much. I am Dr. Nisar Chaudhry with the Pakistan American League. Thank you for expanding the picture and also showing that the wheel of time cannot be reversed. The diversity is really the strength of this country because everybody gets constitutional protection. But as you mentioned about elections also, the elections are actually held in 8 to 10 states. And that too, the fate of the candidate is decided by the minorities, by Hispanics and Black people. What is this phenomena? And you talked of interfaith dialogues. In Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, in those countries, first they need intrafaith dialogue. Do you think even in this country, some kind of intrafaith dialogue is needed to move forward?
Thank you.
Okay. All right, that's 3. You're not going to give me 4, right?
No.
Okay. So let me go back to gender, the question of gender. So one of the places where it shows up is in this attendance thing. One of the things we see among evangelicals, for example, the women are much more likely to attend weekly or more. And that's actually driving some of this Trump, lesser support among Trump, among more attending evangelicals. So that's one place where we see a kind of gender gap is among the more frequently attending evangelicals that then translates, I think, into
Which could
Trump.
be more about Trump's problem with women than his problem with the church attenders.
Yeah, that's right. It's all wrapped up together, I think, there. So Bill, on your question of Congress, I mean, I think it's a really astute point, right? So that you've shown in your work sort of the decline of the number of mainline Protestant representatives in Congress, right? In the Senate, first in the House, and then in the Senate, right? So you would lose them first in the House because the bar is a little higher in the Senate, and then Bill Galston's also mentioned the Supreme Court, right? 2010 was we lost our last Protestant on the Supreme Court. I want to kind of put an accent point on that too, because there's been 119 Protestant justices, in the history of the court. There are 0 on the court now, and right now it's all Catholics and Jews, right, on the Supreme Court. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there's also been, I don't remember the exact number, but I mean, it's only been a handful of Jews that have ever served on the Supreme Court, and a big chunk of them are serving right now on the Supreme Court. So that's been a big change. At first African-American in the White House, this sea change in the Congress. So you can see it. You can see this shift in kind of the sort of power, particularly of white mainline Protestants, which were much more upscale in terms of education and income and power in the country, and you can really see the sea change, coming through. And Congress, because it's an elite institution, tends to kind of lag behind the population, right? So we're seeing this. What we haven't quite seen in Congress is the rise of a lot of unaffiliated members of Congress, right? But I think that's coming. That as the country really shifts. And then the last question on interfaith work, I sort of mentioned these buildings, and great ways to come back to the United Methodist building, the Interchurch Center in New York. I mean, one of the real transformations has been from these buildings representing power bases of white Protestant, and if anybody else wants to join the parade, okay, great, but we're leading the parade and going forward. And now I think they're acting much more like midwives in a sense, are kind of, they're not sort of saying, this is what we're doing and fine if you want to join us, but there's a lot more, like, I think, humility and collaborative approach by necessity in these groups. I do think the thing that we'll have to see, though, is I think we're maybe moving beyond the interfaith dialogue phase and into, like, what are people going to do together, right? So it's not just sort of talking across lines of religious difference, but, like, trying to figure out, is there a way, and I think it's an open question, is there a way for other religious groups to join with these groups, or these other groups may just do their own thing? I mean, I think we're still waiting to see what that's going to look like in our national politics. So.
Well, I can now confess that when E.J. and I met a quarter of a century ago, we agreed on many things, including deploring the religious composition of the court. And so we launched a conspiracy to change that. And I think we can now declare between us complete success at Robbie's expense. Okay, I'm going to shift to the other side of the room now. There's a gentleman in the back, and then a woman right in front of the gentleman in the back, and then there's a gentleman also in the back. So,
hello, Matt Bolger from the American Humanist Association. The argument has been made that those who are atheistic or religiously affiliated in their youth become more religious as they get older. Do you think that will be the case with this current generation of atheists? And if that's not the case, what do you think the political impact will be of having a large number of senior citizens who are non-religious and who vote at higher levels than the youth?
Catherine Reed, I'm with Equality Virginia, but actually my question has to do with the role of women inside these mainline Protestant religions. I know a lot of fabulous women pastors who have taken over very big churches like Amy Butler at Riverside in Manhattan, but in some churches, there are not a lot of roles for women. And so there is a gender discrepancy inside the churches for women who want leadership positions, while at the same time, the Tea Party has been driven by the Phyllis Schlafly and these evangelical women who actually have wielded an enormous amount of shadow power throughout decades of elections that have led to the very extreme conservative position against abortion. How do you see mainline Protestant religions figuring out how to create a role for women so that we have a better balance?
Thank you. Sir, Mohammed So, just a student. Question is very quick. A lot of your presentation was on demographic changes, the loss of demographic power for white Christian Americans. My question is, on a local and state level, has that really translated into a loss of economic and institutional power? It can seem at times, at least when I read the news, that at the local level, the state level, that when it comes to things like abortion, policing, voter ID laws, so on and so forth, that white Christian Americans seem to be winning that war, quote unquote. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, I'll start in the back. So it's a great question about. So one quick thing of clarification. That sort of number, what it's like, more than 1 in 5 Americans are religiously unaffiliated. That includes people who say atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular, right? So it's not just atheists in that number. So I want to be really careful about that. But having said that, the question is, there's been there's some evidence that people in their 20s. They're busy, they have multiple jobs, they're moving around a lot, so they're not active in churches, but once they get married, they get a mortgage and some kids, right, they sort of head back to church, right? So I think there's some kernel of truth to that, but there's a couple of reasons why, even if that effect is in place, so let's say we grant that effect is going to be there, this generation will still be the most religiously unaffiliated generation we've ever seen. And the reason is, if we look back at the baby boomers in their 20s, this generation is still much more unaffiliated than the baby boomers were in their 20s. So it's starting off at a much higher level of disaffiliation. The other thing is that we're just starting to see, my colleague Dan Cox has written a great piece on this, we're just starting to see that the religiously unaffiliated have been around long enough that what tended to happen was that a religiously unaffiliated person would marry someone who was affiliated, and that sort of mixed marriage would pull the unaffiliated one back to a religious institution, especially when there were kids involved. What's happening now is that because of political polarization and ideological polarization, that unaffiliated people are actually seeking out other unaffiliated people as marriage partners, right? And that means there's no partner to pull the other one back to a religious institution anymore. And I think we'll be seeing many more people raised as unaffiliated, just intentionally raised, not with an affiliation. The other question on women clergy. So generally speaking, there's been many more places in the more liberal mainline Protestant world for women than there has been in the evangelical world, right? It's a mixed bag in the evangelical world, and some churches will allow them to be deacons, others won't. Some will allow them to preach, some of them won't. In the mainline world, there's been many more official roles for women. But having said that, the last data I saw, even among mainliners, is that when you're talking about the big, tall, steeple, prestigious churches, those still overwhelmingly go to men, even in the mainline Protestant world. And so there's still a kind of gap in the clergy gap, even in the mainline Protestant world there. And then the last question here was about the local level. I think that you're right to say, and if I go back to that chart and say where is white Christian America still, really strong, and it is in the sort of deep South, up through Appalachia and parts of the Midwest. The difference, though, that I think 3 or 4 decades ago. Again, you could use this term, the moral majority. I think, take my home state, like white evangelicals in Mississippi 4 decades ago could, I think, march on under the illusion that most of the rest of the country broadly shared their values, right? That is no longer possible. And I think that changes the game. All right, so even if you're in a state like Mississippi where you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a Baptist, that you are in a place, those people are still in a place, and sort of my friends and family that are still in Mississippi are under no illusions that the rest of the country shares their basic set of values. So it changes their posture, I think, toward the sort of broader national conversation.
Could I just plug another book for the person who
about
asked?
to plug?
Melissa's.
Oh, you got it, yeah.
Yeah, our friend Melissa Deckman. This is on your
Right
question
here.
about women. Where are you?
Right there.
Oh, welcome. I didn't even know you were here. Melissa wrote a great book called Tea Party Women. I love the subtitle. Mama Grizzlies, Grassroots Leaders, and the Changing Face of the American Right. So
And
you might be interested in her book.
Yeah, I mean, and the point she made was exactly your point, that the Tea Party provided places outside of the Republican structure for women to get involved and take leadership positions, and that was a real strength of the Tea Party. So E.J. saved me because Melissa's the chair of PRI's board. So
Well, if I could riff
That
on
was the Holy Spirit at work.
if I could riff on Edward Edwards for just a minute, looking forward a generation, you won't be able to swing a cat in Mississippi without hitting a dead Baptist. So, okay, we have time for one more tranche, and I'm coming to the front. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. And yes, sir. But it's going to have to be quick. No extended preludes.
Well, this morning in your op-ed piece, you referenced an evangelical working for the Trump campaign who said, well, he's been a good father. And one could argue that Hillary Clinton, who did not seek a divorce when some might, was being a good Christian Methodist white religious person. So my question goes to, what is the role, doesn't that relate to early on when she said, I'm no milk and cookies woman, which was sort of, take that, Father knows best?
Thank you.
Right there.
Whoa. Right in front here.
Thanks very much, Robbie. Garrett Mitchell, write the Mitchell Report, and I'm struck by the fact that it's really difficult to sort of think about all that you've said today without thinking about the last week, the last month, etc. And that takes me to, I think it was your last slide that shows who thinks things are getting better and who thinks things are getting worse. And I'm struck by the fact, and I don't know whether your data can get us there, but I'd be interested in your view of this, which is, one could look at that and say, well, there's some good news there. There are people who are feeling better about things than there are people who are feeling worse about things. But is there in the work that you've done, in your sense of, or if you took that same group of people in the various classifications and you said, is America on the right track or is America on the wrong track? Which track do you think those folks think we're on?
Got it, thanks. Right in the front here.
Thank you. Larry Checco, columnist for Accountability Central. You used a very interesting word, Robbie, the narrative. And I grew up in the 50s. I don't want to give my age away. I know I look a lot younger. But I grew up in that narrative, the white Christian American narrative. And it was a strong one. And not being of that group, there are aspirations that you wanted to be of that group. Can we now, with the diversification that's going on in this country over the last 50 or 60 years, can we only have one narrative that's going to be that strong again?
Yeah.
That's a good question. That's a great closing question.
All right, I'll come back to that one at the end. So, I think you're right. So one of the interesting things is in 2008, I went to an event where both Barack Obama and I'm forgetting the university now. They're going to kill me, but it was in Pennsylvania. That Evangelical University hosted a conversation on faith with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Do you remember where this was?
Could it have been Muhlenberg or?
No. E. Starts with E, I think. Anyway, I'll come back to it.
Earlham?
Not Eastern.
Earlham?
Eastern, yes.
Eastern, so I'll figure it out.
We'll figure it out. Anyway.
St. Google will help.
Well, but what was interesting is that, Hillary Clinton talked very eloquently about her Methodist upbringing, the impact that it had on her life, how it fits with her political views. And we're hearing less of that, I think, in this election cycle. And I think it's partially because her supporters don't expect that of her. But I also think it's because that rhetoric by necessity has gone away on the Republican side of the ticket, right? We're not seeing a lot now that Cruz is not in the primary anymore. We've lost Cruz, Santorum, Huckabee, all the people who foregrounded that talk about gave their own testimony, talked about Jesus, how Jesus had shaped their life. And we're not seeing that conversation on really either side of the debates. I mean, one of the things we've seen is, I think, a real evacuation of God talk for good or ill, across both sides of the debate. But Hillary Clinton's she told a very compelling story about how these things connected up for her and informed her life. And remind me, your question was the
right track, wrong track.
Right track, yeah. About the right track, wrong track. And the stuff around racial tensions. And so there's a chart on the book, I think it's on page 154, that breaks out the attitudes on whether we had this really illuminating question that asked, do you think that the recent killings of black men by police are isolated incidents or part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans? And not surprisingly, more than 3/4 of African Americans say it's part of a broader pattern of how police treat African Americans. And what we found is that about half as many whites overall agreed with that statement. And when we broke it down by religion, there was this kind of really interesting divide between unaffiliated whites, among whom 2/3 agreed with African Americans that it was part of a broader pattern. But when we looked at white mainline Protestants, only 43% of them agreed with the statement. And we looked at white evangelical statements, only 29% of them agreed that it was part of a broader pattern. So, when you look at those kinds of divides, what you see is that, it's not just that people are disagreeing about what to do about a problem, right? There is a clash of worldviews that don't even perceive the same set of problems, right? So it's a very deep-seated problem, I think. And in the chapter on race, I really dig into this and try to, I think Russell Moore actually has been one of the better voices in the Southern Baptist Convention, trying to get particularly white evangelical Protestants to rethink their knee-jerk reactions to racial politics. And I think that's a really important thing for white Christians in particular, to approach these issues with a lot more humility than I think they have in the past. And then the last question over here was single narrative.
By the way, I think it was Eastern University where Tony Campolo, a well-known progressive evangelical, teaches.
Thank you. It's interesting. I was looking the other day at a survey I hadn't seen. It was conducted a couple of years ago by MTV, of all things. So they interviewed 13 to 16-year-olds, and they asked them, because one of the challenges with polling the younger generation is we're now we've been calling the younger generation millennials, right, for some time. So it's Gen Y, Gen X, and then millennials. But we're kind of running out of the period where we can keep calling them millennials, because the younger edge of that group is now really, we're 18 to 35. It's a big span now. So there's a younger edge of that group that's probably something else, and trying to figure out where that dividing line is. So they interviewed 13 to 16-year-olds, and they threw out a bunch of names to them and asked them what they would self-label their own generation. Like, they gave them a bunch of names that they could pick from. And interestingly enough, the one that came to mind, the one that won out of all the names was the favorite label was the Founders Generation. And what they meant by that was that the millennials generation they saw as the disruptive generation that broke with the era of with kind of the era of the past. There's a lot of disruption, a lot of change, and that this younger generation coming along behind them, they saw as actually the Founders generation that was going to tell a different kind of narrative about what it meant to be American, what it meant to sort of, what it meant to belong, I think. Now, whether it's going to be one or multiple, I don't know, but I think that there's some hopefulness for that, I think, in my mind at least, that this group is thinking like, there is something new that has happened, and we're sort of growing into a new era, and I do think, it's not going to be people my age or older who's going to figure that out. I do think it's going to be the younger generation that's going to finally figure this out.
So, on that hopeful note of a forthcoming new E Pluribus Unum, please join me in congratulating Rob Aiken.